Welcome to Part 5 of the Mongoose Hello World series. In Part 4, we updated our items facility with the ability to import a picture, and we created the orders facility, which we used to create a few demo orders. Now we're going to complete the orders facility by joining a few tables, adding a few property class extensions to support drill downs, and we'll be adding a property class that calculates the total order amount. Let's start by joining a few tables. Open the IDO collections form. I'll open it from the most recently used form list. It's labeled IDOs here. It opens in filter in place mode, so type orders into the IDO name field and press F4 to execute filter in place. Click the new table button. This allows us to create a table join or a reference to existing tables. In the table name dropdown, select customers. The table alias defaults to cus, which is okay. And finally, we want the conditions of the join to be ID equals orders, customer ID. And then press add and OK. Then we want to create another table join, so press the new table button again and select items for the name. And then change the table alias to ITM. And the conditions of this join are item equals orders, item, and then press add and OK. With our new table joins created on the orders IDO, click the tables button and select the customers table. Click on bind properties, and we want to deselect all of the properties except address and name. Click the Massage Property Names button, and let's also massage these two property names with the prefix cus with a capital C. Click OK and finish. Now we want to do the same thing on the items table. Select the items table and click Bind Properties. This time, deselect all properties except cost, description, and picture. Then we want to massage these three property names with the prefix ITM, again with the capital I. Click OK and finish. Back on the IDOs form, we should add a few attributes to some of these new properties. Click the Properties button, which opens the properties on the Orders IDO. On the cus address property, add the label string ID saddress. Then on the item cost property, select the cost property class to inherit the attributes on the cost property class. On the item description property, add the label string ID s item description. On the cus name property, add the label string ID s customer name. On the item picture property, select the property class picture to inherit the attributes on the picture property class. The last one we need to edit is on the customer ID property. Change the label string ID from SID to S customer ID. As you can tell, none of these modifications were major, but it's always a good idea to make sure your strings and attributes are consistent. With all of our properties looking good, let's add a new property on the orders IDO that'll contain the calculated total order amount once we build that. So far, all of the IDO properties we've used have been bound to columns on tables. But IDO properties can also be calculations, input to server-side update logic, or they can be relationships to other IDOs. Click the New Property button, select Derived, and click Next. Name the property dir order total. The dir prefix is a useful naming convention indicating that this is a derived property. Assign the cost property class, which will allow this property to inherit the attributes we assigned on the cost property class. Below we can set the expression, which needs to be count, space times, space capital I, TM, capital C, OST. Click Finish, then click Yes to the prompt asking us if we'd like to save our changes to IDEO properties. Once our new property is created, we're back on the IDEO properties form with our new dir order total property selected. We should change the label string ID sCost coming from the cost property class to sorderTotal. We also want this property to be read-only because its only purpose is to display the total value, so check the read-only box. Then we can save and press Ctrl U to unload the cache. Go ahead and close the forms. Next, let's create property class extensions for the item and customer ID property classes to enable them to have drill down. This is the same process as we went through in Part 4, so this should look familiar. A reminder that property class extensions are a level of the inheritance model. Open the orders form and enter design mode. Select Site Default for our editing scope, and select the Item Combo box. In the Properties panel, expand Inheritance, and in the Edit Property Class Extension field, click the ellipsis. Respond Yes to create the Item Property Class extension. In the Behavior section, expand Add Details and Find Forms, and for the Add Details form, drop the list, type Items to select the Items form. Do the same thing in the Find Form field below. In the Property field, type Item with a capital I to assign the item property. Below that, we need to set the right-click menu to Standard Details Add Find. Click OK to get back to the form. Now we can do the same thing to create the extension for the Customer ID property class. OK, now select the Customer ID combo box, and in the Properties panel, click the ellipsis in the Edit Property Class extension field. Again, respond Yes to create the Customer ID property class extension. Expand Add Details and Find Forms, and drop the list. Type CUST to select Customers, and do the same for the Find Form field below that. In the Property field, type capital ID. Scroll down and set the right-click menu to Standard Details Add Find. Click OK, and we can press the Save and Close button. In Part 4, when we ran the new data maintenance wizard for orders, we created the orders table, orders IDO, and orders form. Now we're going to rebuild the orders form so we can use the new properties we just created. In addition to the new data maintenance wizard, there is also a new form wizard which creates a form against an existing IDO or a form for other purposes. A template of our wizard information was saved from the orders form, so we can use that template rather than starting from scratch. This is often useful for complex forms. In design mode, go to Form, Definition, New. We want to create a new form, which is selected by default, so click Next. From the Form Template Name dropdown, select the Orders Form template. Click Next, and respond Yes to replace the orders form. Our new properties now show as available for binding on the form. We want to resequence the properties into a specific order. I find it's easiest to remove them all first using the button at the bottom, and then include the ones that I want. Hold down Control and select Order Number, Customer ID, Cus Name, Cus Address, Item, Item Description, Item Cost, Item Picture, Count, and dir order total. Then click the Add Property button. Click Next, and in the Item Description property row, add the caption sDescription. Click Next, and Finish. We get a prompt asking us to create the strings that don't exist. Note that we can opt to automatically create the strings that don't exist, so we don't see this prompt, but I'll just click Yes to create the strings. Our new orders form, complete with all of the properties we selected, opens. To test the form, enter Run mode and press Refresh on the toolbar to query the orders we created at the end of Part 4. Try right-clicking Details on Customer ID and Item to make sure our property class extensions are working. Both look good. Let's also check to see that the order total calculation is working. Change the count and press refresh. Yes, we want to save our changes. And the order total now reflects our one bike for $100 for a total of $100. Let's switch gears and talk about item images. The item picture we're joining isn't textual data, it's a PNG image file. We can't see it right now, so we need to adjust the form a bit. Enter Design Mode and delete the static labeled picture by selecting it and pressing Delete. Then select the Picture Edit component, and in the Properties panel, change the type from Edit to Static. Clear the caption field and expand Miscellaneous, then Specific Attributes, and change No colon to True. This disables displaying a colon on the right side of the static, which is useful when using a static as a label. Make the form bigger and drag the static that's going to be displaying our image down and make it larger. Resize the grid by selecting it and dragging the bottom down. When you're done, save the form and enter Run Mode to test. Query the orders by pressing Refresh, and we see our picture is displayed on the static component. As we cycle through our orders, the picture changes. Enter Design Mode and organize the form components until you have something you're happy with. Once you're done, save and close the form. Let's touch on some facilities Mongoose provides that we haven't talked about yet. Wouldn't it be nice if you could select a customer ID or an item, and the joined-in fields would immediately fill in rather than waiting until the data was saved and the collection was re-queried? We can do this with a validator. To pack this functionality up and make it reusable, we can use a component class, which is a level of the inheritance model. In Design Mode, open the Edit menu. We have a variety of objects that forms use that are global, and we can access them from the Edit menu while in Design Mode. This acts as a nice central location if we need to edit one of these global objects, like a variable, a string, or a validator. The definitions for these global objects are metadata which is stored in the Forms database, along with the form definitions. Select Validator, and click New to create a validator named Customer ID. Drop the list of validator types. There are several different types of validators, and we want to use one of the most commonly used types, which is an in-collection validator. In the Parameters field, click the ellipsis. Mongoose will provide a particular dialog based on the validator type, which will prompt us for the information required to perform the validations. In the IDO dropdown, select the customer's IDO. Then click on the Property button and select the Customer ID property that's on the customer's IDO. Click OK. For an in-collection validator like this, Mongoose will format a where clause based on the current component's value in this properties column to perform the validation. Mongoose executes a database query with an in-collection validator, so if other values are needed from the table, it's an efficient time to get them during this query. In our case, along with the validations, we want to bring back the customer name and customer address fields and place those onto the form. To do this, click the Set Properties Variables Components button. Validator outputs can go into variables or components on the form, and they can also go into properties and collections on the form. Because we're trying to create a validator that we can reuse on multiple forms, we don't want to hardwire any names to receive these values. Type %1 equals name with a capital N, comma space %2 equals address with a capital A into the Properties field. When we use the validator, we'll pass it the names of the properties we want to get the customer name and customer address values placed into. Click OK back to the Validator Properties dialog. In the error message field, drop the list and type MIS to select the error message string. M is not a valid. M is a prefix convention for translated strings which are used for validator error messages. There are some substitutions in this string that make a good generic validator error message. Click the ellipsis on the error message field, and in the string value field, we see %v is not a valid %l. WinStudio will replace the %v and %l at runtime. Click OK, OK, then Done, and save. Yes, we want to save the string even though it's not locked. Press Ctrl-U to unload the cache. With our validator built, let's package it up along with some other attributes with a list source into a component class so it can be reused within our app. To create the component class, we'll use the Edit menu to browse our global objects and select Component Class. Click New and name the component class Customer ID. Scroll down and under the Data Source section, expand Validation, and click the ellipsis in the Validators field. Click the Add button and select the Customer ID validator we just created, and click OK. We need to pass the %1 and %2 parameters to the validator. Doing this will effectively pass whatever was passed to the component class straight through to the validator. Click the params icon and enter %1, space, %2, and click OK back to the component class properties window. Under the validation section, set Validate Immediately to True. The last thing we need to define on our component class is a list source. We're inheriting a list of ID and name from the Customer ID property class, but the Customer ID validator we created has output of both the customer name property and address property. By default for efficiency, when the user selects a value from the dropdown as opposed to typing a value in, Mongoose avoids making an actual round trip to query from the database, assuming that the list entries are all valid values. So we need a list source that includes not only ID and name, but also address. In the list source field, click the ellipsis. In the list source type dropdown, select IDO collection. In the IDO dropdown, select the customer's IDO. Click the Properties button and select the ID, click Add, Name, then Add, and Address properties from the customer's IDO, and click OK. We don't want to show the address in the dropdown, we just want to have it available, so click the Columns to Display button and we can choose ID and Name. Click OK and Done to get back to the WinStudio home screen, and then save and press Ctrl-U to unload the cache. With our validator and list source nicely packaged up into a component class named Customer ID, we can use this on our orders form. Open the orders form from the most recently used form list. Enter Design Mode, and select the Customer ID combo box. Expand Inheritance, and select the component class Customer ID, which contains our validator and list source. In the component class parameters field below that, type cusName, space, cusAddress, which will receive our customer name and customer address properties. Save and enter run mode to test. Query our demo data by pressing F5 and select a different customer ID, and note that customer name and address immediately update. This is because we've inherited Validate Immediately and we have a validator with output rules. We also have a grid column that's bound to the Customer ID property, so let's use this component class on that too. Pressing Ctrl-2 will toggle the splitter, which is a handy shortcut. Enter Design Mode and select the Customer ID column by selecting the entire grid and clicking on the Edit Grid Columns button in the top left corner of the grid. Select the Customer ID grid column, and just like we did for the Customer ID combo box, under Inheritance, select the Customer ID component class. In the parameters field below that, again type cusName, space, cusAddress. Click OK, save, and enter run mode to test. Change the customer ID on the grid this time, and make sure the customer name and address immediately update. Press Ctrl 2 to toggle the splitter again. Nice work! We just built a validator, packed it up into a component class along with a list source, and applied it to first the customer ID combo box component, and then we applied it to the customer ID grid column. Let's replicate what we just did on the customer ID combo and grid column on the item combo and grid column to allow them to update immediately and bring back some additional data from the query. Enter design mode and select Edit and scroll down to Validator. Click New to create the validator named Item. The validator type is in collection, and then click the ellipsis in the parameters field. Select the item's IDO, and then click on the property button to select the item property on the item's IDO. To set the output rule, click on the Set Properties Variables Components button, and in the Properties field, type %1 equals description with a capital D, comma space, %2 equals cost with a capital C. Click OK twice to get back to the validator properties, and drop the error message list. Type M to select the error message. M is not a valid. Click OK, then Done to get back to the form. Save, then press Ctrl U to unload the cache. Now that the item validator is created, let's package this up into a component class to make it reusable. To create the component class, under the Edit menu, select Component Class. Click New, and name the component class Item. Scroll down and expand Validation, and in the Validators field, click the ellipsis. Click on the Add button, select the item validator we created, and click OK. Next, click on the Parameters button and enter %1, comma space, %2. Again, we need to pass the %1 and %2 parameters to the validator. Doing this will effectively pass whatever was passed to the component class straight through to the validator. Click OK back to the item component class properties and set Validate Immediately to True. Next, set the list source. Click the ellipsis in the list source field, set the list source type to IDO collection, and select the item's IDO. Click the Properties button, and we can select the item, description, and cost properties off of the item's IDO. Then click OK. Click the Columns to Display button, and out of those three properties, we only want to display item and description, so select those two, and click OK, and Done to get back to the form. Save, and press Ctrl U to unload the cache. The next step is to assign the item component class to the item combo box, and then to the item grid column. Back on the form, select the item combo box, and under the inheritance section, select the item component class. In the component class parameters field below that, type ITM description, comma space, ITM cost. Save, and enter run mode to test. Make sure that when you select a new item, the description and cost immediately update. Finally, we want to do the same thing on the item grid column. Enter design mode and select the grid. Click the Edit Grid Columns button and select the item grid column. Scroll down and under Inheritance, assign the item component class. In the component class parameters field below that, type ITM description, comma space, ITM cost. Click OK back to the form and save. Enter run mode, and press Ctrl 2 to toggle the splitter. Make sure that when you select a new item, the description and cost immediately update. Looks good. If you need to take a break, now's a good time to pause. Next, we're going to get into adding some code. Mongoose enables development with minimal coding, but we're able to add code in a variety of locations within our apps. We can add .NET code into forms called by WinStudio and into the app server where it's called by the IDEO runtime. We only have time to show a quick example of adding code in this series, so keep in mind that this is only scratching the surface of the possibilities. Let's get into some form scripting. Press Ctrl 2 to toggle the splitter again. When we change the item or the count on an order, the value of the order total should change. But in its current state, this computation is done during the query, which means that it only happens when we save or query the data. We want this calculation to be done immediately on the client, and we can do this by writing some .NET code. To select your script editor, go to View, User Preferences. Click on the Design Time tab, and in the Script Editor box, select the script editor you want to use. Mongoose supports Visual Studio, but if you don't have that installed, you can use the built-in lightweight script editor labeled WinStudio here. In this example, I'll be using Visual Studio. Click OK, and WinStudio will verify that Visual Studio is available on your machine, which takes a few seconds. Enter Design Mode, and in the Edit menu, scroll down and select Script Editor. VB.NET and C# are supported. VB.NET is the default, and it's what we'll be using here. In Visual Studio, highlight these 3 lines that read Methods Go here, and we can insert our form script. We can see via IntelliSense that there's a rich object model available from our client code. Here's the code. Public sub, calc order total, parenthesis, order count, as string, comma space item cost, as string, in parenthesis, dim order total as decimal. Order total equals CDEC, parenthesis order count, close parenthesis, space asterisk, space CDEC, parenthesis item cost, in parenthesis. This form dot primary IDEO collection dot set current object property plus modify refresh, parenthesis quotation dir order total, quotation, comma space, order total, dot to string, open parenthesis and then 2 close parentheses, end sub. Note that additional validation could be done for ensuring the data is in proper integer decimal format, but this simple example assumes it is, does the calculation, and then uses the Mongoose scripting API to put the result into the current property. Click Build to make sure there aren't any errors. Get back into WinStudio and click Compile. Notice that the compile status now reads compiled. Press Close and then Save. The code is now saved into the Forms database. Now we can use WinStudio events to trigger that code. We need to generate an event when either the item or count changes. Then we'll need to create a handler that'll trigger our code when it sees that event. On the Orders form, select the Item combo box, and on the Events tab, find the Data Change Event field. We want to generate an event named Recalc Order Total anytime data is changed in this combo box. Let's do the same thing on the Count edit. Select it, and in the Data Change event, generate the event named Recalc Order Total. After validations have succeeded, this data changed event is generated. Now that changes to either item or the count will generate our event, we need to create an event handler for it. Go to Edit, Event Handler, and click New. The event we want to handle is the Recalc Order Total event that our changes will generate. Set the response type to Form Script method, and click the ellipsis on the Parameters field. Click on Type-Specific Parameters, and select the Calc Order Total form script. In the Parameters field below that, type P, parenthesis count, in parenthesis, comma space P, parenthesis, ITM cost, in parenthesis. We could have added code in our script to pull these values, but by passing them in via a substitution keyword like this, we reduce the amount of code we have to write. Click OK back to the form, and save. Enter run mode and let's test. Change the count, then change the item, and note that the order total is updating. This is as far as we're going to go into core Mongoose development in this series, but there is much more you can learn. We have additional tutorials and documentation available on the Mongoose portal. In our 6th and final part in this series, we'll build a consumer UI web portal version of our store that uses everything we've built so far.